All right. Welcome back, players. This is Jack with 36 Cancel. I am here with Colton of the Clock Tower. Say hello, Colton.
Hi. Unfortunately, I'm not Coco the Weiss Cat. I'm sorry, everybody.
No, he's not Coco. Coco is actually outside the room right now because she is probably eating. Just filled her bowl up, and she's happy about that. But while that's keeping her busy, we wanted to have a small conversation with you folks at home about a topic that came up during the car ride home that we all experience after going to our locals as we're talking to our card playing buddies. So I've got a few friends that play different TCGs. Some of them play One Piece, some of them play Y-Cross. A lot of us do play Weiss Schwarz, and a few others that are dipped in there, Pokemon, Digimon, etc. I think one of us plays MHA. I'm not sure which one. I don't think... Well, anyway, that's beside the point. The point is, we were talking about the struggles of getting better at these various card games, what it takes to become an intermediate player from a beginner, and from an intermediate player to an advanced player, and maybe someday an advanced player to an expert. And the topic was broached on the struggles of getting better in these games, and what it specifically took for each game. I was talking to them about Weiss Schwarz, obviously, because that's my main game, and I mentioned that one of the biggest struggles I was experiencing in trying to become a better player, because granted, I've got a lot of room to grow, don't get me wrong here. One of the things I was struggling with at the moment was really getting my stock straight. You know, it's one of the more basic things you can do in your quest to get better to know where certain cards are, when you will trigger climaxes, when you will trigger important cards like your level 3s, etc. To know, even if it's just in stock or not, even if you don't know the position, that's a great way to start off in getting better and starting to really know where your cards are and make better decisions. However, I would imagine a lot of the better players, of which I don't know very many personally, because I'm not a very good player, probably know a lot more about their stock than I do. So what I've been trying to do is get better at memorizing my stock. Unfortunately, that's very difficult because stock changes every turn, and you're going to end up trying to memorize the position of like 3, 4, even 5 cards, and then 3 or 4 of them change per turn a lot of the times. So that's a lot of things. There have been a lot of studies on the subject, actually, and it's pretty widely recognized that in your short-term memory, the average person can juggle about 7 different distinct things, like numbers, positions, little squares on a game of memory, etc. So theoretically, you could keep track of like 7 stock between you and your opponent, because you definitely want at least some information on your opponent's side, being that you can't see their stock once it goes down either. Granted, when you add into the mix a lot of things that change turn by turn, and the other events you need to keep in your short-term memory, obviously this gets very challenging, and I'm sure a lot of us have been in the position where we knew what was in our stock at the start of our turn, a lot of things happened, we tried to calculate power, we thought about how we were attacking, we did our attacks, we did our combos, and then at the end of the turn we go to think about what's in our stock, and we're like, oh, I lost my climax position, I don't know where it is now. Has that happened to you, Colton?
Oh, yeah. I would say that the first step from going from a true beginner in Weiss to, as you said, a more intermediate level player is compression and figuring out how how compression works and getting yourself into a better deck state so that you're more likely to cancel. And the second thing is stock watching.
So I'm on step 2.
A unique challenge because it doesn't show up in other games, right? Like there aren't other games where like cards go to blind zones, but the cards in those zones are constantly changing, right? And it gets especially complicated when we talk about things like stock bombs and, so now things are moving around in our stock as well. Things are getting paid up or down, as it were. So stock is an interesting and unique challenge for Weiss players in particular, and I'm going to be honest, like for me, I focus on where my CX is, because my 7 slots, as it were, are filled up by other things going on the board, where my climaxes are in my stock, where my climaxes are in my opponent's stock. I can't even begin to remember what every card is in my stock. So yeah, that's definitely something that I struggle with as well.
Well, I think most people struggle with it. I'm sure there are a select few on the top that when you trigger, and every time they trigger, they just know where things are. I mean, you see that person play, and you absolutely know that they're that person. It's very easy to tell a lot of the time. I'm not that person. You don't sound like you think you're that person.
I'm not there. No, I wish I was. I play with at least one person who I think is, but the best players are, and that's kind of the thing. That's one of the things that separates, I think, like the best players in the world from the very good players of the world.
For sure.
Is the difference between a very good player will know where the climaxes are, and maybe remember that there's a key card in there somewhere. Maybe remember that there's a level 3 combo in there somewhere, or maybe one of their opponent's counters got triggered, something like that. But the best players, I feel like they know where every card is in both players' stock, especially their stock, at all times.
Yes, I would 100% agree with that. Now, it's interesting that you mention that the stock challenge in getting better and memorizing the positions of your stock is unique to Weiss Schwarz, because that was exactly the point that came up in our car ride home. This is a unique challenge to Weiss Schwarz. In other games, when it comes to cards moving between open and closed zones, there just aren't really many other examples of cards that move between these zones so many times, and yet are so important to keep track of that they would influence your decisions. That phenomena really is unique to Weiss Schwarz in a lot of ways, and stock is a unique mechanic even within Weiss Schwarz. There really isn't other parts of Weiss Schwarz that are moving that are like that. And the other unique thing about this is you could make the argument that this doesn't really require game knowledge or game skill per se, but only memorization. Now, granted, memorization is a huge part of any card game when it comes to memorizing card effects, when it comes to memorizing your opponent's effects that they have, when it comes to game knowledge in general. However, one of the good things about that, if you're a card game player, is you can commit those things to long-term memory, so it's not that much of a challenge to dredge them up when you're in the middle of the game. However, short-term memory, like we said, is different, and stock can really occupy a lot of your short-term memory, but that's all it demands of you. So, what we were talking about in the car ride home, and this is finally us broaching the topic after how long now, would it be better, or would it change things, if stock was in some way more visible to the player? Would it make the game more enjoyable, and how would it change Weiss Schwarz if that was the case? Now, Colton, what are your immediate thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there are a handful of different ways that question can be approached, right? And they come from kind of different facets of the game. One is the rote information aspect. When you trigger stock, everyone sees what it is. Everyone sees the trigger. Everyone sees it go away, and then it's closed, right? So in theory, everyone has perfect information already about what's in stock. In practice, we don't, because we don't remember.
Right.
And leaving that zone open, like if you, for example, let's just say that because there are multiple different ways this could be implemented. Let's just say that you trigger face up, and then you move that card into stock face up. Like nothing else changes about stock other than that card is now face up in stock. That makes it so much easier to track everything. Like that's the obvious thing, right? Like it's very clear that is the primary effect that happens. Everyone gets to know where everyone's climaxes in stock are, in particular, at all times. I think the first thing that does is it shrinks a little bit of the talent gap between the top and the middle.
I would hard agree with that.
And the middle and the bottom.
Now, you can also
because
argue...
that's a piece of information that a good player or a really good player is going to have more of a handle on than a beginner player. But now, by making that information public for both players, you kind of equalize that. You take that element of skill out of the game, and it shrinks the difference between the top and the bottom.
Right. Now, what I was going to cover before people jump down our throats on this subject, because people absolutely will, the first thing I imagine most people who have spent any amount of time trying to get good at memorizing their stock would say to this is get good, which, dude, trust me, I am so sympathetic to the get good argument, okay? I've played my Souls games, I've beat Millennia, I'm all about a challenge, so don't jump down my throat on that front, all right? But, all that said, we can always strive for improvement. I'm not even saying, even at the start of this conversation, that I want this to happen. It's just a thought experiment. It's something we were talking about, again, in one of those car ride homes after tournaments. And I thought I'd have Colton on. I thought I would request kindly that Colton join me in the conversation in kind of hashing this out, just to see what we would come up with on our own, what you players think at home of this idea, and maybe someday, well, I say someday as if there's a long future in this, but at some point, play a few games where we actually do play with our stock face up and see what our reactions are. It could be an interesting little video series, could not be, we'll see. Now, the next part of the question of open stock is how do you implement open stock? Because there are several Weiss Schwarz mechanics that are purposeful in the intent that the information they generate in terms of stock is closed. What I'm talking about is the treasure climax that puts the top card of your deck into your stock. And obviously it's face down, which balances the treasure climax a little bit in the sense that you don't know if you like blind trigger to climax. Balancing out, obviously, the fact that you get to add that climax to your hand. It's pretty good. Also, you have the stock swap effects in Weiss Schwarz, which can be absolutely devastating to both players. If you are in a position where you stock swap your opponent because you think they have a very compressed deck, you can stock swap them, and maybe you hit, like, let's say 10 cards out of 20 on a really strong stock swap. However, you don't know if, let's say, in those 20 cards they had 6 climaxes, if you hit, like, 1 climax or all 6. So you don't know how good that stock swap was. So that's part of the battle too. So in implementation, we have to ask ourselves, how do we think about open stock if we're bridging that thought experiment? Is it open to everyone? Is it just sitting face up? Is there a mix of blind stock and stock that is not blind? Can only you look at it? Like, you can pick up your own stock, but it's not necessarily open to your opponent, and you have to keep track of your opponent's stock because it's not open to you. And just my immediate thoughts on those, and I'll get to you in a sec, Colton. Just let me get this one thought out, is that I really think the stock only being open to the player who owns it would get very difficult to manage very quickly. When you're picking up face-down cards that don't change order, when you hit like more than 2 or 3 cards, it's just going to be very difficult to mechanically handle in a way that makes you feel safe that your opponent isn't reordering them, in my opinion anyway. Is that kind of your feeling on it? Or do you think differently?
Yeah, I think that the way that we talk about open zones and closed zones in like a rules context, there is only one zone in the game that I think there's only the one zone in the game where a player is allowed to know what cards are there, but their opponent is not, and that's hand. Right? So
I think you're generally correct on that. I think there could be like fringe elements.
I'm trying to remember if like I don't think you're allowed to look at a face down card in memory at all.
I also don't play JP, so there could be a card in JP that does it that we just don't know about.
Right.
But I think we can safely say for this conversation that your hand is the other unique portion of that. It's really the only other place where that exists. So we'll go with that for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that being the case, so stock, obviously, like, it doesn't get played like hand. But it would need to be almost watched in a certain way. Because, like, if I have this information and my opponent doesn't, like, the order of cards in my hand doesn't matter. I can arrange the cards in my hand any way I want. It doesn't matter. But you could theoretically, not even theoretically, if stock is closed, then somehow you have to be able to look at those cards without rearranging them. And if I pick up my whole stock, it wouldn't take a whole lot, especially on like a webcam game or, in a busy tournament environment. Wouldn't even be hard to switch cards around, and my opponent would have absolutely no way to check that I had.
This is very true. And another element of that...
And there would be no way to... Like, you can't call a judge over and say, he switched these cards, and then, the other player just says, no, I didn't. There's no way to actually enforce that because it's an unknown quantity.
No, you're right on that. And just on the topic of not only cheating, but once you get a few more cards in your stock, like 5 or 6, I think it would be just very easy to just fumble it. And let's say you drop a stock or two and the order matters, and that's it. You can't repair the game state anymore.
Right. And do you really want someone to lose a game because they knocked knocked their stock off the table. Like,
No, I wouldn't think so either, which is why I think that particular method of implementation, where it's only open to you and your opponent is only open to your opponent, I don't think that will be the right way to go about it if we were to experiment with it. I think we can just abandon that because it just has too many mechanical problems. So what we're left with is, do you have a mix where regular stock that is triggered is open and effects that put cards in the top of your deck into your stock are closed, like stock swaps and bars? Or is everything now completely open? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the challenge with mixing it would be that you would almost have to errata everything that puts stock into, that puts cards into stock to say one way or the other. Because for example, like on a stock soul climax, right? If you play a red stock soul climax and you're allowed to put a red card from your waiting room into your stock, does that go in face up or face down? Right?
Oh, absolutely. It'd be a nightmare.
Exactly. So like policing which effects do and don't go in face up, I think would be a bit of a pain. So I think one way or the other would be the way to go, personally. It would either need to be all open or all closed. And I think this is part of the thing where this is a part of the thing where we just changed the refresh rule, right?
Yes.
Like the refresh rule just changed. It's a relatively minor change, and frankly, it affects very, very little in terms of like strategic play.
This is true.
Like the only time it really matters is if you I think the only time it really makes an effect is like when you're at 1/6 and whether or not a last card trigger has targets in the waiting room. Right? So like it's very, very niche in terms of the actual practical effect it has on the game. I think that this would kind of feel the same way, where if this had been the way that we'd been playing Weiss for the past 15 years, we would probably just, like, the idea of stock being blind would be very weird.
Well, for sure.
You know what I mean?
think
Just
there's a
because
lot
it's
of
what we've
minor
gotten
changes
used
that
to.
would definitely have that true of them. Oh, I lost my train of thought here. But no, I agree.
Yeah, I think the primary change, if it were face up, which I think is the only way you could do it realistically, again, unless you just heavily errated everything and you just had a list of like what did and didn't go in face up. I think your best bet is to, if you're going to make this change, they all have to be face up. And I think the biggest change is there are two big changes. One is the player skill one that we've kind of talked about. And the second one is, there may be times when you would have played a stock swap on a blind set of stock and you wouldn't because you see, because my opponent's playing bar, they've blind stocked 2 CXs and, I otherwise wouldn't have known that. You know what I mean?
For sure.
And there are also some other effects. Like I know there's a card, there's an event in Persona 4. I don't know if there's anything else. I mean, Persona 4, I know, right? But it's put the top card of your deck into your stock, and then you search your stock for a character, reveal it, and then shuffle your stock.
Oh, Christ.
Like, shuffling your stock means nothing in that context. And obviously, no one's playing this card, because no one's playing Persona 4. I mean, not above, like, a casual level, right? So
I really feel like you would have to almost take cards like that are older and have effects like that, because I'm pretty sure there aren't many modern cards that do anything like that, or at least ones that are popular now.
So.
I think if you were going to implement an open stock system, it wouldn't be too difficult to amend or errata these cards, or even restrict them in a sense that they wouldn't do something that really changed the nature of an open stock.
No, it wouldn't. I don't think that it would. I don't think it would be a big deal, but I do think it'd be something that would need to be like thought about. It would need to be considered, at least to a certain extent, especially because, stay with me on this. I really liked the video you did a while back when you were talking about how cards are weighted in Weiss. You explained it in a way that I thought was really intuitive. You talked about like the fulcrum.
Oh, I remember that video.
A card is kind of balanced around. What's that?
I remember that video now that you're saying the fulcrum.
Yeah, no, I thought that video was excellent. I thought that the way you described this was perfect, because I've been trying to like find a way to explain to people like how card balance in Weiss works, and one of the reasons why the
That video would be very different if I made it in 2022, let me tell you what.
it would be. But at the same time, I think it's also one of the reasons that Weiss hasn't. If you look at Weiss versus other games, the power creep in Weiss is significantly smaller than it is in other games.
100%.
And it's because of that fulcrum effect. Like, it does kind of keep the reins on them. Like, they find ways around it, and they do just straight up bump up power thresholds and make things overcosted from time to time. You know, they've raised the threshold before, and they probably will again. But the reason I bring that up is because cards like that have now kind of determined what the shuffle your stock cost, like what the effect costs on a card, if that makes sense.
No, it does. If you change the effect of the card and what it does, you probably will need to change, or at least think about changing what it costs and whether you'd run it, or what errata you would have to make it, to amend to it to make it playable again, if it was playable in the first place. You know, that even is subjective on its own. And of course, this is the part where someone in the comments is going to say, like, 5 different cards that neither of us thought off at the top of our heads that are, like, very affected by the conversation we're having.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's the nature of having a game that's been around this long, right? You know, there are so many different things that do so many different... there's so many different cards that do so many different things that have all of these wonky effects that, you know, you otherwise might not have expected.
Yes, speaking of memorization...
Yeah, no kidding. But then there are other cards like, so there's one actually in quintuplets in the TD, which I think is interesting. It's the Itsuki Green 0. Its cost is that you put the top card of your stock into your clock. On play, you can pay the cost, and if you do, search your deck for a specific Itsuki.
The Nia Iguren Login actually does that too.
Yeah, like that's an effect that shows up a little bit more often. It's not like a super common effect, but, you know, putting something directly from stock in a clock is an effect that does happen sometimes.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to mention Gurren Lagann.
That's fair. And it's also something that shows up in a modern set, right? Like, quintuplets is a relatively modern set, and it's there. It's an effect that is, you know, in a playable contemporary set. And if knowledge of stock is a thing, if stock is public knowledge, that card suddenly is a little bit different, because now, as much as it is, it's the top card of your stock, right? Like, in theory, you should probably remember what it is, but maybe you don't, right? You know, there, you know, for the reasons that we've mentioned. So it's kind of this, like, weird half-blind clock, in a way.
It can be.
Whereas, so that's costed probably a little bit differently than, say, a Takitsubo effect, which is, you know, pay 1 clock the top card of your deck.
Now, of course, nowadays, everything's so good that it just lets you choose what you put into your clock from your waiting room. Whole life.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, but what you're talking about there in terms of paying out stock... sorry, I didn't mean to run over you.
No, you're good. I was just saying, like, this whole conversation, like, honestly might just be completely moot, just because none of these effects could potentially ever matter again, even in the game that we play already.
Yes, very true. But what I was going to say is that is the battle really with open stock, because when you have open stock, you can make better decisions based on what's in your stock and where those cards will end up once you move them out of the zone. Not just going from your stock to the top of your clock with cards like Nia or the Itsuki, but let's say I'm in a scenario where I have a bunch of level 3s I'd like to play, you know, for 2 stock each. And I'm wondering how many I can get away with playing, or how many will be good enough to play, or whether I brainstorm in the midst of those in terms of paying out stock in a way that makes sense. Like, let's say there's a climax somewhere within that stock. That's what we're really talking about. How smart can we be when playing with that stock, and how much information does it introduce to the average player that impacts their gameplay? And the answer could be quite a lot, or it could be nothing, depending on your skill level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially in Weiss, given that, you know, what information is and isn't public is very strict for the most part. There are very few cards that say, look at your opponent's hand. You know?
Oh, yes.
So there aren't a ton of effects that give you access to otherwise blind zones.
I think Weiss Schwarz is actually one of the only card games I've ever seen that you can't, like, straight up discard your opponent.
Yeah, like, well, so that's actually, it was interesting because I was watching the Pittsburgh set review for the new Dragon Maid set that's coming out. And there is a card in red. It's a 2/1 Kana. I think it's 5,500 power. On play, your opponent randomly ditches a card.
Wow, for real?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, and I think that's the only card in English that does this. I don't know if I've ever seen anything else that does anything like that, other than I know the calling card in Persona 5, your opponent discards.
No, they put something face down in
to
memory. Yeah, and then they draw a card if they want
but
to.
But they get to choose what that is, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like...
And you get to replace the card.
Yes, and you get to replace the card. So, like, there's no thought seize.
No.
Right? Like, that just doesn't exist in Weiss. There's nothing even remotely like that.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's a very differently designed game in terms of, like, messing with your opponent's resources and messing with what your resources are when they're in a closed zone, like stock. So open stock definitely would change that dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, I think that stock is in a weird spot because it is like a semi-closed zone. You know what I mean? Like, in theory, the information was public when it went in.
Yes.
So that's kind of like, that's where it's different from, like, the deck, right? The deck, you just have no idea. Like, it's legitimately 100% completely blind. Whereas stock, in theory, has been revealed. And that also means that, in theory, your opponent could know exactly where all the cards are, but they wouldn't have any way to prove it necessarily. So I think that it's possible that they would maybe need to make a ruling on that. They would need to have some kind of... I mean, I guess not, if we're talking about making stock completely open.
No, I don't think we need to make a ruling like that if all stock was completely open, which I think by this point in the discussion we've really decided is the most effective way to implement this if you were going to implement it in theory.
Yeah.
So all that said, I think we've really hashed out a lot of the pros and cons just in a free-form format. So why don't we just go back and forth now with a simple, do you think this is a good idea? Do you not? Do you think it has merit? Do you think it could change the game in a good way or a bad way? I'll start off on that front. I think there is a strong argument to be made that this could change the game in a very positive way. I think you are absolutely correct when you said it will lessen the skill gap between a lot of players, and there's a lot of arguments to be made whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Generally, when I think about it in a way where it allows more players to make more informed, more finesse, and, in general, better plays. If all players are making better plays, the game becomes more challenging and more engaging for all players. That's my immediate thought process on it, and for that reason, I think it definitely could be something productive to look into. Now, what do you think, Colton?
It's a good question. I don't think I feel super strongly one way or the other. On one hand, one of the things that makes Weiss and, card games in general fun to play is the fact that your skill as a player directly correlates to your success in game. As much as it doesn't feel like it a lot of time.
For sure.
The more if you've played 1,000 games of Weiss, you're going to be a better player, and if you've seen the lines and you know what you're doing, and you're going to be a better player. And there's something to be said for rewarding that. On the flip side, I also think that opening up stock would make more powerful decks more powerful, because that eliminates some of the player skill that can make a less good deck better, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So, like, if a bad player is playing the best deck in the meta and a good player is playing something that's just okay, one of the ways that the good player can still win the game is by understanding how their stock works and what's going on in stock, whereas the bad player may not. So I think that leaving stock open could potentially decide more games based on the strength of the deck rather than the strength of the player, which I think is usually a negative consequence, although not always, because I think that it's good to reward player strength over deck strength, especially because, of the particularly strong things that Bushiroad seems want to print these days. So I'd be a little I'd be a little cautious about making that change for that reason. Not because like I'm not, I sympathize with Get Good.
Yes, we all sympathize with Get
But
Good
it
here.
is
We're not anti Get Good on this channel, okay?
right. I sympathize with it, but I am not an advocate, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Like
You're not in the comments saying Get
I
Good.
right. I'm not like not everyone has to be a tryhard, right? Like it's okay.
Right.
But at the same time, I would be a little bit concerned that changing that would allow better decks to run even more unimpeded, because one of the ways that you check a good deck is by being a good player. And when you take even just a little bit of player skill out of the game, it can make the deck itself be the thing that shines and is strong and make it harder to beat.
No, I would agree with you.
Maybe even
there.
infinitesimally. Like maybe it wouldn't have that much of an effect, but I think that over a broad stretch of time, I think this change might consolidate the top of the meta just a little bit.
That's certainly another topic we were talking about on the car ride home, what is in the Weiss meta right now. And that is a topic I do not dare cover on this channel because I do not have the player skill or know how to put anything out there that's even remotely valuable on the subject.
Well, guess who did do just that?
I would imagine someone in this call I brought in for just this purpose because they are a better player than me and they have insight that I don't.
That is a big statement that you've just made, and I'm not sure that is true. But yeah, we actually did make a video about the meta coming into BCS. So if you're playing in the regional tournaments coming up and you're like, hey, what is in the meta? We kind of answered that question. We made a really good video. I think it's a good video about it. And we made another video where we talk about different matchups between the top decks in the meta. So if you want to check those out, Clock Tower Weiss Schwarz on YouTube. A lot of good stuff there. Also, Darcy from WCC made a tier list video that you should check out. And Pittsburgh, on the day we're recording this, actually made a really good video talking about the best decks going into BCS and what makes them so strong. So a lot of good stuff. WeissTube is like on something right now. There have been some really, really good videos in the past month or so, and we're just rolling right now. So much good content from so many good creators.
Absolutely. There are many good Weiss tubers out there, far more than when I started, and I'm very happy to see that. I'm also very happy they're making content that I do not have the balls to make on this channel, like tier lists. So you should definitely check out everything Colton mentioned there. And of course, again, check out his channel, The Clock Tower, Weiss Schwarz on YouTube. And I want to thank you for having this conversation with me, Colton. It was very generous of you to donate your time and thoughts to this topic that's kind of esoteric and meaningless in the long run, but it was a fun conversation.
I mean, let's be real. This card game is pretty esoteric and meaningless in the long run. So,
well, if you want to get into solipsism here,
I consider none of this a waste. It's always a joy to hang out with you, Jack. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, let's do this stuff again sometime. This was a lot of fun.
It was. I'll think of another topic, and maybe one of these days we can play one of those stock face-up games and see how we feel about it. Maybe post it on the channel.
I'd be down.
And
let's
maybe
do it.
not, because it could be a disaster. But we'll go from there.
It could be a disaster, but it would be an entertaining disaster. And why are we on YouTube for any reason other than to showcase disaster for the purpose of monetizing it?
Well, I was with you until that last part.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't make any money off of this platform either.
I think a lot of people playing Weiss don't make money on this platform. But anyway, we'll leave it at that, players. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to the conversation. Again, check out Colton and all the wonderful content the Clock Tower has made. They put a lot of effort into the videos. They're very well researched. And if you're looking for anything even remotely useful for meta talk, which I certainly don't provide, look to them first. Again, thank you, Colton, for being online with me in this conversation. And we will see you players in the next video. Thank you for watching as always, and peace.